Perhaps more than ever before, it's easy to find news articles and commentators insisting that most voters think, feel, and want one thing, and just as many articles insisting the exact opposite. And so perhaps, more than ever before, a scientific, comprehensive, and objective look at what Americans are really thinking is essential for cutting through the noise and spin. Offering up just that kind of reliable data is the Public Religion Research Institute, which has just released the 2016 edition of the Invaluable American Values Survey. And I'm delighted to be joined once again by PRRI CEO, Dr. Robert P. Jones. Robbie, welcome back to State of Belief Radio.
Hi, Welton. I'm happy to be back.
You know, I don't know whether it's because I am so ravenously hungry for trustworthy information or what, but reading through the summaries of this research on this year's values survey, I think it's the best one that I've read yet, and I think it's the most helpful I've read. And I'm really grateful for it, and I'm grateful for you being here to tell our listeners about it. So let's begin. Not everybody understands this survey has been coming out for a long time, and they don't know as much about it as I would like for them to. So would you just start by briefly summarizing what you were looking to find out this year?
Yeah. Well, thanks for that introduction. So for the last 7 years, since 2010, PRRI and the Brookings Institution have been teaming up to offer kind of our take on the state of play, particularly in religion and politics, each fall. And so this is our seventh one. And, what we try to do here is not so much, give one more lens on the horse race, who's up, who's down, but try to step a little bit back from the fray and look for the bigger patterns, I think, that are really underlying, are driving the horse race numbers. So, I think that's mostly what we're up to, is trying to figure out, what are the big dividing lines? What are the big tectonic, pieces that are moving, that we mostly just see in these kind of Clinton versus Trump numbers, but we're trying to get a little bit of a bigger picture.
But it seems to me, influenced pretty heavily by the election, because the kinds of questions you're asking, or you were asking, are questions that are right at the heart of people making decisions about for whom to vote.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think what we're trying to, maybe a short way of putting it is, we're trying to get beyond the, what or the who are you supporting question, and more to the kind of why are you supporting, the candidate you're supporting, or why are you behind the party you're supporting, and trying to think about, what are the kind of bigger or deeper things that are driving people to support the candidates they're supporting.
Robbie, when I got through reading the materials, there were two words lodged in my brain, and I've got to tell you what they are, because I'd like to know if I'm close to where you are in your thoughts about it. This is about division and pessimism. Tell me what else. Tell me what else is there.
Yeah, I think their division is right. I mean, it's really striking across how many issues, the division, and the divisions are really deep. They're by race, they're by party, and it's hard to see, that many things where things are bridging. I mean, just on the issues, a couple of examples. I mean, we do have kind of issues that, some of the most important things in the country are things that people think are critical issues are terrorism, both Democrats and Republicans. People across race agree with that, and also jobs and unemployment. And after that, it really does, move in different directions. I mean, the top two issues, for example, for Democrats are race relations and the growing gap between the rich and the poor, and those are absolutely at the bottom of the list of 10 issues for Republicans.
What do you consider as being the most significant among the responses you got?
Yeah. Well, I think the bigger, even to kind of telescope out even beyond the issues, I do think this referendum, I wrote about this in my book, The End of White Christian America, a bit, but this survey really confirmed some of the hunches that I had there, that this election really is about the future of the country. It is, and the key question that we had in the survey that I kind of wrapped my presentation up with yesterday at Brookings was this question of whether the country has changed for the better or changed for the worse since the 1950s.
Yeah.
And the country is just divided absolutely right down the middle on this question, and two-thirds of Democrats say the country has changed mostly for the better, and two-thirds of Republicans say it has changed for the worse. And if you get into religious space, two-thirds of the religiously unaffiliated Americans say it's changed for the better, and three-quarters of white evangelical Protestants say it's changed for the worse.
Well, as someone that's been looking at this closely all the time, were you surprised by that, or did that just confirm what you had been seeing?
Yeah, well, we've been asking this question for a few years now, and it basically looks like this. There's been virtually no movement on this question over time, but just the absolute perfect symmetry that there is, kind of partisan polarization, there's racial polarization on this question, there's religious polarization on this question, and we really do, I think, have half the country in a state of kind of grieving and lament over the kind of demographic and cultural changes in the country, and we have another half of the country that's leaning in and even celebrating these shifts.
I guess it's predictable that this would happen, but I was really impressed and a little bit scared by the reality of how many people really want a strong authoritarian leader with the kind of hope that kind of person can get us going again, and yet when you go on down in the findings of the survey, that's true, but there is no agreement on that kind of leader being on the horizon. And that must say something about the frustration of the American people as well as the divisions among them.
Well, I do think frustration is right. That we have more than 6 in 10, for example, Americans saying that neither political party represents their views anymore. And that's up significantly since the 1990s, for example. And this question was asked in 1990. Less than half of Americans said that. But today it's more than 6 in 10 say neither political party is representing their views. And as you've heard, our survey confirms this again. We're dealing with two candidates from each party that are the most unpopular candidates that have ever really been run by either party in a modern election. But then there is this question, you said about authoritarianism, and the question that we asked was whether you agree or disagree with this question. Because things have gotten so far off track in this country, we need a leader who is willing to break some rules if that's what it takes to make things right. And on that question, we had 46% of Americans agree with it, 52% disagree. So kind of more on the disagree side than the agree. But then when you look at the partisan splits, a majority of Republicans, 55% of those agree, 57% of Democrats disagree. So, what's clear here is that there are more Republicans seeing that quality in Trump than there are Democrats seeing that quality in Clinton.
I've been really eager to ask you this next question because a lot has been written about the split between Catholic and evangelical voters in terms of supporting Donald Trump. So did you see that division as you look at differences between various religious groups in this country?
Yeah, this election is scrambling the religious kind of alliances a little bit. I mean, historically, what we've essentially seen are white Christian voters, since Reagan at least, white Christian voters leaning toward Republican candidates and kind of everyone else leaning toward Democratic presidential candidates. And we're seeing a little bit of a crack in that kind of white Christian wall of support for Republican candidates this election cycle, and we're seeing, for example, white evangelicals as strong as ever. Our latest numbers for white evangelicals are that 69% of them are supporting Trump. Hillary Clinton's well below 20%. But we're seeing like white Catholics, for example. Mitt Romney won white Catholics by 19 points in 2012, and right now we're showing white Catholics to be evenly divided. So there's a real pullback from Trump, from the kind of support you might expect him to have among that constituency. And also Mormons have been, a real surprise, I think, in this election, where the state of Utah, which has been one of the reddest of the red states, is now not a safe Republican state. It still leans Republican, but it's been taken out of that safe Republican category, put in a lean Republican category, and so much so that we got Mike Pence going to Utah to campaign, which is not something you would expect a Republican candidate to have to worry about at this stage of the election.
You've already mentioned this once. Frankly, I was rather stunned to read that a majority of respondents feel unrepresented by either major political party.
Yeah.
Now, it's one thing when candidates are as unpopular as Trump and Clinton are, but it's quite another when the parties themselves are not trusted. Would you talk some more about that?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mentioned this is up significantly. It's up more than it's actually up 13 percentage points since the early 1990s. When still we were already at half of the country in the 1990s saying that neither represent their views. That's actually pretty high. And now we've got more than 6 in 10. And I think it's really where we are today. It's actually fueled by younger people as well, being even more likely to say that they're not seeing their views represented in political parties. So, I think it does have to do with this kind of wave of younger people who tend to register as independents. They don't really claim either political party, a real distrust of institutions by that group. And then that, I think it's that factor plus many Republicans in particular being dissatisfied with Trump and the way that the Republican Party has moved through, kind of very clumsily moved through this election cycle.
Without embarrassment, I am going to be repetitious, as I always am, and ask you a question that is always on my mind when we do one of these conversations. What did you find most surprising in the results of this survey?
Yeah, in this one, sometimes I have to stumble around and kind of think. In this one, I think it's actually pretty easy, and that is, in this really hyper-divided environment, we found a new question. We hadn't asked this question before. It's a policy question, and we asked people about whether people who have been convicted with felonies should be allowed to vote after they complete their sentences. Because, as you know, this is a state-by-state issue, and various states have laws on the books. Florida, for example, has a law on the books that if you've been convicted of a felony, you lose your right to vote forever. And there's been a movement afoot to give those people, after they serve their time and they're back in society, to give them their vote back. And this disproportionately affects African Americans in the country. And what we found, strikingly, is that 3/4 of Americans actually agree that people who've been convicted of felonies should be allowed to vote after they complete their sentences. And it's striking. There's virtually no differences across party, across race, across age groups, education levels. I mean, every kind of break that you would normally see, there's virtual consensus. So, 83% of Democrats, 73% of independents, 62% of Republicans agree, 85% of African Americans, 78% of Hispanics, 71% of whites. It's a rare occasion these days where you see, something that's an actual concrete policy issue, and there's just virtual consensus across the board on it.
It is so beneficial to have had these discussions with you on the Americans Value Survey year after year, and that lends itself to comparisons. And I wonder, are there trends that you see that are of particularly significant, trends that cross all of these years?
Yeah, the mood in the country has been pretty dim, really, since we've started this, because we started this really on the, in 2010 was our first survey, and that was, we were still in the throes of recovering from the recession. I think one thing I would say is that it's striking that even this far out, when most economists are telling us that we have, we're technically not in a recession anymore, the unemployment rates are low, there's a number of other economic indicators that look pretty good, and yet the economic mood in the country is still pretty dim. We did see a slight uptick in this survey of people being less pessimistic about their children's economic outlook compared to a few years ago. But, whether the country's on the right track or the wrong track, still heavily negative, and just a lot of pessimism across a bunch of other questions. So it's clear that, the country still hasn't come out of this, I think, kind of sense of gloom, really, following the 2008 recession.
I think it's pretty clear, Robbie, that in the age of social media and hyper-partisanship, the kind of work that you do is for sure more important than ever. At the same time, we're seeing attempts to challenge and even discredit objective research if it conflicts with partisan agendas. And at first, am I right in seeing that is a growing threat? And second, how do you handle it?
Yeah. Well, one of the challenges is that there has also been a proliferation of polling, and not all of it is scientific, right? So that means there's more numbers out there with percent signs after them, but they don't all have the same kind of quality. So we're getting some help on this front. Places like Nate Silver's 538 site is kind of grading different polls, both on their past performance measured against elections and also on their methodology. And I think, one of the things people have to do is just become a little bit of a more savvy consumer of polling. I'll recommend, actually, Nate Cohn at the New York Times wrote a pretty nice piece about a month ago on basically how to read polls, how to be a savvy consumer of polls. And, the main thing is, solid methodology, solid sampling, that's random probability sampling, transparency, and reputation really is everything at the end of the day here. And so it is a challenge both because I think people are, in general, inundated with polls, and also they're kind of people just are motivated to believe things that, can confirm their preconceived ideas and be skeptical about things that aren't. That's kind of human nature. But I do think there are ways to sift through it. It just takes a little more time and patience.
Robbie, what are you most likely to be criticized about in a poll like this?
Well, in this one, because we wanted to get a bigger sample and we wanted to get kind of take some more time to really think through the findings. One criticism might be that, so this is data from September, right? And we're releasing it in October. Now, in normal years, that wouldn't be a big deal, but in an election year, a lot changes, in a month's time. So this is a snapshot of voters' attitudes in September, really, and so it doesn't take into account, for example, the release of tapes that the kind of tapes where Trump was making lewd remarks about women. And anything else has happened in the meantime. But I think what's helpful about it, though, is that by taking a little more time, asking more in-depth questions, we get kind of this picture of the underlying dynamics that sit underneath, any particular event or any particular remarks that get made that are really part of what's kind of baked into the election. The other things kind of the foundations that are baked into the election dynamics. And I think that's a really helpful thing. But I think, that's one thing you could say is, well, it's a 30-day-old snapshot.
Well, let me follow up on that with another question that's related to it. Not long ago, you were on the show talking about your very timely new book, The End of White Christian America. I was actually surprised to get some listener feedback that expressed fear that by simply talking about the trends that you wrote about, we would provoke backlash from people who are unhappy about those trends. Is that kind of thing ever a concern in the work you do, that just revealing the facts can actually then serve to influence those same facts going forward?
Sure. It's always the case. I guess I'm a big believer, though, in transparency, and I'm a big believer in kind of understanding the lay of the land. I tend to think about this. If you want the healthiest dynamics in our political and democratic life, you got to have people operating from a shared sense of reality and shared sense of facts. I think when you don't know what's going on, you end up doing all kinds of stuff. I mean, the analogy I sometimes give is, if you're a married couple or you're someone you're married to, and you end up in this kind of big fight over something dumb, like who left a towel on the bathroom floor for the 10th time, and you end up, in the second hour into this fight, you realize you're not really fighting over the towel, you're fighting over something that happened last week, and then once you sort that out, you realize, that actually reflects something that happened early in the relationship. It's a much bigger, you've touched a nerve, right, that kind of goes way back to the foundations of the relationship. I think that some of what's happening in our politics right now reflects that we're arguing over Obamacare, we're arguing over immigration, but what we're really arguing about is something much deeper, and that is, like, who are we going to be as Americans, and what is the country going to look like going forward, and is that going to be okay? And I think it's that deeper thing, and if we don't realize that's what we're fighting over, I think we just end up having these apocalyptic arguments over minute policy issues without taking a step back and realizing there's a much bigger argument that's just taking place in these little bits and pieces.
Well, I can tell you that there is an explanation for that I have as well, and it's implicit in what you've said. I want to make it explicit. This is one time when I can say to you that working on sermons is somewhat the same as the work that you're doing in polling, because what I find is, and I can say this in relation to having drawn from your book and put that in a sermon, that people who don't like the truth always question the credibility of the source.
Yep.
And so, rather than dealing with reality, it's a lot easier to say, they just don't know what they're talking about.
Right.
I think in your case, I hope in mine, you do know what you're talking about because you do this with great expertise. Dr. Robert P. Jones is CEO of the Public Religion Research Institute, which has just released the 2016 edition of the Comprehensive Annual American Values Survey. He's also the author of the timely new book, The End of White Christian America. Robbie, as I said at the beginning, the kind of research and analysis that you're doing is more important than ever. You do it so well, and I really appreciate you being with us and sharing that information with us on State of Belief Radio.
Well, thanks, Welton, for those kind words, and I'm always happy to be here.